At 6:45 a.m. on November 3rd, 2023, sunlight barely pierced through the thick autumn fog enveloping the quiet suburb of Greenhaven. The quaint streets, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and picture-perfect houses, were just beginning to stir. Emma Pearson, 36 years old, sat at the edge of her king-sized bed, staring blankly at the dark wood floor. Her husband, Richard, had already left for his morning run, as he did every day at 5:30 a.m. without fail. His routine was as predictable as the rising sun, but lately it was the one thing she could no longer rely on. Emma rose slowly, her movements heavy with the weight of sleepless nights and lingering doubt. The house, nestled at the end of Maple Street, was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of a neighbor's leaf blower. This house had been their sanctuary for nearly 10 years, but now it felt more like a stranger's home. She walked downstairs, her bare feet cold against the polished hardwood. In the kitchen, she mechanically prepared a pot of coffee, glancing at the clock on the wall, 7:10 a.m. She had 20 minutes before she needed to get ready for work. The coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the room with the rich, familiar scent of brewing coffee. It was a comfort she clung to, but it couldn't chase away the gnawing unease that had settled deep within her. 2 days ago, at precisely 11:48 p.m., she had found a crumpled receipt in Richard's jacket pocket. It was for a dinner at L'Atelier, a French restaurant in the city, dated October 30th. The timestamp read 8:35 p.m., a night Richard was supposed to have been at a late meeting. She hadn't asked him about it. Instead, she'd slipped it back into his pocket, pretending she had never seen it, but the discovery festered like a wound. It wasn't just the receipt. There were other signs, small at first, but now impossible to ignore. The unexplained absences, the sudden urgency in his phone calls, and the way he seemed to drift further away from her with each passing day. She remembered the night of October 15th when Richard had come home late again. It was nearly midnight, and he hadn't even apologized, just headed straight to the shower, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. That night, she had lain awake until 3 a.m., listening to the rhythmic sound of water running, her mind racing with questions she was too afraid to ask. By 7:30 a.m., Emma was dressed and ready to leave for work, but the house felt heavier with each step she took towards the door. She paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, feeling an inexplicable urge to turn back. Something was wrong, something far deeper than the lies she suspected. As she stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit her, sending a shiver down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was out there, waiting to shatter the fragile world she had built. The clock read 7:35 a.m. as she locked the door behind her, bracing herself for what the day might bring. On November 4th, 2023, at 11:15 a.m., Emma sat in her car, parked just a few blocks away from the office building where she worked as a marketing manager. The engine idled quietly, a steady hum beneath the tension that gripped her chest. She had planned to go inside hours ago, but something had kept her glued to the seat, her mind spinning with possibilities she couldn't ignore. The receipt she had found days earlier gnawed at her thoughts, its innocuous presence now an undeniable symbol of the growing distance between her and Richard. Emma's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she replayed the events of the previous night. Richard had come home late again, 10:22 p.m., according to the kitchen clock she had been staring at. When he finally walked in, his eyes were evasive, his explanations vague. He had mentioned something about a delayed train, but his words lacked conviction, his voice tinged with a nervousness she hadn't noticed before. There was something he wasn't telling her, and it was driving her mad. The unanswered questions had kept her awake until 2 a.m., long after Richard had fallen into a deep, undisturbed sleep. She had watched him in the darkness, his breathing slow and steady, while her thoughts raced uncontrollably. What was he hiding? Who was he really with that night at L'Atelier? The answers seemed just out of reach, tantalizing and terrifying at the same time. At 11:45 a.m., Emma made a decision. She couldn't keep tormenting herself with suspicions and half-truths. She needed to know for sure. Shifting the car into drive, she headed towards Richard's office in downtown Greenhaven. The roads were clear, the usual weekend traffic light as she navigated the familiar streets. It was a route she had driven countless times before, but today, it felt foreign, as if each turn brought her closer to an uncomfortable truth she wasn't prepared to face. By 12:10 p.m., she was parked in front of Richard's office building, a sleek, glass-fronted structure that loomed over the quiet street. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered vehicles, one of which she recognized immediately, Richard's silver sedan. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stared at the car, her pulse quickening with every passing second. Emma had never been the suspicious type, but the growing distance between them, combined with the evidence she had uncovered, had changed that. The receipt, the late nights, the whispered phone calls, it all added up to something more than just a busy work schedule. She felt it deep in her bones, a certainty that twisted her stomach in knots. At 12:30 p.m., Emma decided to go inside. The lobby was quiet, the receptionist absent from her usual post, likely out for lunch. Emma moved quickly, slipping into the stairwell to avoid the security cameras she knew dotted the elevator bank. She had been here often enough to know her way around, but today, the familiar corridors felt more like a labyrinth, each step echoing ominously in the silence. By 12:45 p.m., she had reached the 5th floor. Richard's office was at the end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar. Emma hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What if he was in a meeting? What if she was wrong about everything? But the thought of turning back, of returning to a life built on lies, was more unbearable than the fear of what she might find. Taking a deep breath, Emma pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was empty, the faint smell of cologne lingering in the air. Richard's desk was neat, as always, with papers stacked in orderly piles. But it was the corner of the room that caught her attention, a framed photograph on the small side table. It was new, something she had never seen before. The picture was of Richard, but not with her. He stood beside another man, their arms around each other, smiles wide and genuine. Emma's blood ran cold. The timestamp on the frame read October 30th, 2023, 8:35 p.m., the same night as the dinner at L'Atelier. Emma felt her knees weaken as the truth settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had expected another woman, a mistress perhaps, but this was something else entirely. The realization hit her like a freight train, and she staggered backward, clutching the edge of the desk for support. At 1 p.m., she fled the office, her mind in turmoil. The photograph had confirmed her worst fears, but it had also opened the door to a whole new world of questions. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? And why hadn't Richard told her the truth? The answers were out there, somewhere, and Emma knew she wouldn't rest until she found them. As she drove away from the building, the clock on the dashboard read 1:15 p.m., but time had lost all meaning. All that mattered now was uncovering the full scope of Richard's deception, no matter the cost. At 9:30 p.m. on November 4th, 2023, Emma sat in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow from the table lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The house was unnervingly silent, save for the distant ticking of the clock above the fireplace, marking each second with a hollow, rhythmic beat. She had returned home nearly 5 hours earlier, but the weight of the discovery she had made at Richard's office kept her rooted to the couch, unable to move, unable to think of anything else. The photograph was burned into her memory. The man standing beside Richard, their smiles hiding the betrayal that had been right under her nose. Richard had texted her at 8:15 p.m., saying he'd be home by 10 p.m., but she knew his schedule now, knew that the man she had thought she knew was living a life filled with lies and deception. It wasn't just the fact that Richard had hidden his relationship with another man. It was the scope of the deception, the lengths he had gone to keep it from her. The realization that her life, her marriage, had been built on a foundation of lies, made her feel like she was drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. At 9:45 p.m., she heard the sound of Richard's car pulling into the driveway. Her heart began to race, her pulse thudding in her ears as she imagined what she would say to him, how she would confront him with the evidence she had found. The door creaked open at 9:48 p.m., and she heard Richard's footsteps as he walked through the hallway, his movements steady and unhurried, completely unaware of the storm waiting for him. Richard entered the living room at 9:50 p.m., and Emma watched as he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of her sitting in the near darkness. He didn't ask why she was up so late, didn't question the tension that hung thick in the air. Instead, he set his keys down on the table, his back turned to her, as if everything was perfectly normal. But Emma's gaze was fixed on him, her thoughts racing as she tried to reconcile the man in front of her with the man she had discovered that afternoon. At 9:55 p.m., Richard finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Emma could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the faint lines around his eyes that she had never really noticed before. But now, she couldn't look away, couldn't stop herself from seeing him for what he really was. A stranger. The silence between them stretched unbearably thin, the air heavy with unspoken words. As the clock struck 10 p.m., Emma could no longer hold back. The questions that had been gnawing at her all day spilled out, each one sharper, more pointed than the last. She needed answers, needed to understand why Richard had chosen to live a lie, to deceive her so completely. She asked about the dinner, about the photograph, about the man he had been seeing. The questions tumbled out, one after another, and with each one, she felt a small part of her hope crumble away. Richard's response was measured, calculated, as if he had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. He didn't deny it. How could he, when the evidence was irrefutable? Instead, he spoke of fear, of shame, of a life lived in the shadows. He told her about the years of hiding, about the suffocating pressure to conform, to be the perfect husband, the perfect man. But as he spoke, Emma realized that his words, though sincere, were empty of the regret she had hoped to hear. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused her, only an explanation that did nothing to ease the hurt that had taken root in her heart. At 10:25 p.m., Emma felt the full weight of Richard's betrayal settle over her, heavy and suffocating. She had loved him, trusted him, built a life with him, and now it was all unraveling before her eyes. The man she had thought she knew was a fabrication, a carefully constructed facade that had finally crumbled under the pressure of the truth. She couldn't bear to look at him anymore, couldn't stand the sight of the man who had torn her world apart. By 10:40 p.m., the confrontation had reached its inevitable conclusion. The distance between them, once so easily bridged by love and trust, now felt insurmountable. Emma knew that nothing would ever be the same, that the life they had shared was over. As Richard left the room at 10:45 p.m., retreating to the silence of the guest bedroom, Emma remained in the living room, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. The clock on the wall read 10:50 p.m., but time felt irrelevant now. All that mattered was the realization that the truth, once uncovered, could never be buried again. Emma knew that this was just the beginning. The confrontation had opened the door to a darker, more painful chapter in her life, one that she would have to face alone. The questions, the lies, the betrayal, they would all have to be reckoned with one way or another. And as she sat there, alone in the darkness, she knew that the next steps she took would determine the course of the rest of her life. On November 5th, 2023, at precisely 7:30 a.m., Emma sat in the corner of the local cafe, a small, nondescript place tucked away on the outskirts of Greenhaven. The morning rush was in full swing, with people hurrying in and out, grabbing their coffee before heading to work. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of chatter, but Emma was oblivious to it all. Her hands gripped the ceramic cup in front of her, the warmth seeping into her skin, grounding her in the present as she replayed the events of the previous night. Richard had left the house early, before 6 a.m., without a word. His side of the bed was cold when Emma woke up, and by 6:15 a.m., she knew he was gone. The note he left was brief, a few lines scrawled on a piece of paper, but it meant nothing to her. She had read it at 6:20 a.m., her heart numb, as she realized the depth of his cowardice. He wasn't ready to face the consequences of the life he had hidden from her, and now Emma was left to pick up the pieces alone. By 7:45 a.m., Emma's mind was already turning over the possibilities. The confrontation had not provided the closure she desperately needed. Instead, it had opened a floodgate of anger and resentment. She couldn't just let him walk away from this, from the life they had built together. Even if it was all a lie, there had to be more. More to his secret life, more to the man in the photograph, more than what Richard had admitted to. The truth was still out there, and Emma was determined to uncover it no matter the cost. At 8:15 a.m., Emma arrived at the Greenhaven Public Library. The building was quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside her. She headed straight to the computers at the back, a plan already forming in her mind. If Richard had hidden this relationship, this entire life, from her, there had to be traces of it somewhere. Social media, emails, anything that could lead her to the man in the photograph. She typed quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her search narrowing down as she cross-referenced names, dates, and locations. By 9 a.m., Emma had found him. The man in the photograph had a name, Michael Harrington. His social media profiles were sparse, but there were enough details to confirm what Emma had feared. The relationship with Richard was deeper than a casual affair. It was something more, something that had been going on for years. There were pictures, dates, and places that matched Richard's travel history perfectly. Trips he had told her were for work, late nights that were supposedly spent at the office. Michael had been there all along. As she scrolled through Michael's posts, Emma felt a wave of nausea. The realization that Richard had lived this double life, had shared moments with Michael that he had denied her, was almost too much to bear. But underneath the hurt was a growing resolve. She couldn't let them get away with this, with the betrayal and the lies. They had taken everything from her, and now she was going to take something back. At 10:30 a.m., Emma made her way to Richard's office. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, oblivious to the turmoil behind Emma's calm exterior. Emma didn't hesitate as she walked past, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. She reached Richard's office at 10:35 a.m., the same office where she had found the photograph just a day before. The room was empty, his desk meticulously clean, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and Emma was about to ensure that Richard felt the impact of that change. She sat down at his desk, her eyes scanning the room for anything she might have missed before. At 10:45 a.m., she opened his laptop, the screen illuminating as it came to life. The password was the same, his mother's birthday, a detail Emma had known for years. As she navigated through his emails and documents, she found more evidence of the life he had hidden from her. Emails to Michael, plans for their future, all laid out in front of her like a confession. But there was something else, something that caught her attention. A folder marked private buried deep in his files. By 11 a.m., Emma had opened the folder. Inside were documents, legal papers, and something that made her blood run cold. Richard had been planning this for months, even years, a way to leave her, to start a new life with Michael, while cutting her out of everything. Financial records showed that he had moved money into secret accounts, hidden assets that Emma had no idea existed. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined, and now there was no turning back. At 11:15 a.m., Emma closed the laptop and stood up, her mind made up. She would confront Richard again, but this time she would be the one in control. The truth was out, and the stakes were higher than ever. As she left the office, the clock in the hallway read 11:20 a.m., but time no longer mattered. What mattered was the confrontation that was coming, the reckoning that Richard and Michael would face. Emma wasn't going to let them win, not now, not ever. The escalation was inevitable, and the next move was hers. At 6:15 p.m. on November 5, 2023, Emma stood outside Michael Harrington's apartment, her breath visible in the crisp evening air. The sky had darkened, and the streetlights cast a cold, pale glow on the quiet, upscale neighborhood. She had been there since 6 p.m., watching, waiting. The anger that had fueled her actions throughout the day had crystallized into a steely resolve. The truth she had uncovered in Richard's files still echoed in her mind, plans to leave her with nothing, to erase her from his life as if she had never existed. At 6:20 p.m., the door to the building opened, and Richard stepped out, his face illuminated briefly by the light from the lobby. He was alone, his expression tense as he glanced around, unaware of Emma's presence in the shadows. She watched him walk down the steps and turn left, heading toward the nearby park where they had often gone together in better times. Emma knew she had to act now, before her courage faltered. Following him from a distance, Emma felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The documents she had found revealed more than just betrayal. They exposed a man she no longer recognized, a man willing to destroy everything she held dear. As Richard walked deeper into the park, the sounds of the city faded away, leaving only the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of traffic. By 6:30 p.m., Emma had closed the distance between them. The park was almost deserted, the paths empty as the early evening chill drove people indoors. Richard stopped near a bench, checking his phone, oblivious to her approach. She knew this was the moment. At 6:32 p.m., she stepped out of the shadows, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Richard turned at the sound of her footsteps, surprise flickering across his face as he saw her standing there. Emma could see the shock in his eyes, the realization that his carefully constructed life was unraveling. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the USB drive that held copies of all the files she had found. The evidence of his betrayal, his plans to leave her destitute, was all there, compressed into one small object that now felt heavy with consequence. At 6:35 p.m., she handed the drive to Richard, her hand trembling slightly as she did so. The weight of everything unsaid hung in the air between them. She watched as he plugged it into his phone, his eyes scanning the screen, widening as he understood the depth of what she had discovered. The betrayal that had once been his alone was now exposed, laid bare for both of them to confront. The minutes ticked by as Richard absorbed the gravity of the situation, but by 6:40 p.m., Emma saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Fear. Fear of losing everything, fear of the truth she now held over him. And in that moment, she knew she had won. Whatever power he thought he had over her was gone, shattered by the evidence she had uncovered. At 6:45 p.m., Emma turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing there in the cold, his world crumbling around him. The confrontation had ended, but the resolution was clear. She would no longer be a victim of his deceit. The truth was out, and with it, the life they had once shared was gone, replaced by something darker, something that could never be undone. As she left the park, the clock on her dashboard read 7 p.m., but time felt irrelevant now. What mattered was that she had taken back control, reclaimed her life from the wreckage Richard had created. The future was uncertain, but as she drove away, Emma felt a strange sense of peace. The storm had passed, and now she was free to start anew, leaving the lies and betrayal behind.